Right, hey guys, welcome back to another game recap. So I'm going to try bang out the rest of these in the next few days because this tournament finished like 2 or 3 weeks ago almost it feels like. So definitely should get the rest of these out as soon as possible before I forget what I was even thinking during these games, right? But this was round 7 game I played versus IM Rishi Sardana, who was a top seed in the tournament, and he was also leading the whole thing on 5.5 out of 6. I was coming second on 4.5 out of 6, and yeah, I also have the black pieces, so definitely a tough game upcoming, but you know, yesterday or the day before this game was a rest day, so felt sort of ready to go. And you know, I was expecting e4, and after c6 Sakara Khan, I don't know, there were a bunch of different lines he's played, so I was sort of looking at a few of those and expecting something like that. But he surprised me on move 1, and he played 1c4, which I completely was not expecting. And well, obviously when he plays 1c4, like, he's going to have some sort of ideas in mind, and usually what I do against the English is I go for something like this, playing in sort of Queen's Gambit decline style, because against like d4, like, I'm usually going to go for some sort of knight f6 d5, sorry, it's knight f6 e6 d5 thing, and so that's what I do against the English, sort of staying true to that nature, because if he goes d4, then I transpose to my normal stuff, and he goes g3, then we just play a game. And usually what I do against this, and what I've pretty much done for most of my life, you could say, is I play d takes d4, and I go for this very solid line after queen a4 check, bishop d7, queen c4, c5, and I just go bishop c6, if allowed, of course, knight bd7, and just try to develop naturally. And usually I get a pretty good game doing that, but I knew that he'd probably looked at this before the game, and that you know, if he's trying to steer the game in this sort of direction, he's obviously gonna have something there. He's gonna, you know, obviously you should trust in your repertoire. I'm not like thinking he's gonna somehow refute this line, right? Because a lot of strong players play this way. But before the tournament, I was also thinking back on some of my English games I'd had last year, and I was like, you know, like, sometimes I'm not really enjoying these positions. They're very solid, but sometimes it's difficult to create a bit of spark in the position, especially against lower end players. It's a different story when you're playing like 2400, but nonetheless, before the tournament, I was looking a bit at this move d4, which is not really revolutionary. This is a well-known idea where you basically try and go for this sort of reverse Benoni structure, which we have here. And I knew that Rishi isn't really a, you know, hardcore English already player, so that by going into this sort of position, I probably would be taking him into a structure where he doesn't necessarily have much of like a home ground advantage, so to speak, because he doesn't really play Benoni with black or with white, from what I understand, because he might go 1d4 on occasion, but 1e4 is definitely his main opening. And I, on the other hand, do play 1d4, so essentially I'm just playing with the black pieces and opening I would play with white. Obviously I'm down a tempo, so that does matter to some extent, but okay, I felt like even if I'm not super on top of all the theory, just the fact that I'm somewhat familiar with playing these Benoni structures alone should be somewhat of to my advantage. But okay, there's sort of two things you can do here. I think the main move is bishop g5, where you basically, because this bishop is always a problem in the Benoni, you sort of want to trade it off in a lot of positions, and you can have something like this and knight bd2, and you can maybe try and go knight e4 next and try and swap these pieces off, right? Which black will usually try and avoid with queen e7. Right now, if knight e4, you just kick this knight away later, probably. But the one problem with this bishop g5 line is that because, like, you know, after h6, you take and stuff, it does tend to lead to a lot of simplifications, and it can sort of make it a little bit difficult to win sometimes, which is sort of what Rishi, after we were talking after the game, his reason for why he played this alternative move, knight a3. Basically, the idea is after castles to go knight c2, and you want to go b4, right? Obviously, you're also threatening to take, so I go e5, and usually people will go b4. This is what I was expecting as well, because like, if I take this, you shouldn't really do that, because then you lose the important e5 pawn, and white has like a lot of play in the b file as well. So usually you should play something like rook e8, protect this pawn, and okay, white can sort of get these queenside pawns rolling, but it's still a complicated position. Instead, in the game, he played bishop g5, which I thought was a bit strange to combine knight a3, knight c2, and this bishop g5 idea. Typically, this isn't considered to be so amazing, but okay, there have been some players who have played this way before. It's not awful. And basically, we had this get the bishop out, knight d2, and as always, usually you don't really want white to just exchange those pieces because they have the space disadvantage, and very often because of that reason, if they can exchange like a few pieces, it makes their position a lot easier to play, and it makes it a lot more difficult for black to sort of attack. So I play queen g6, trying to step out of that fork, and after knight e4 I go bishop e7, keeping my eye over the b4 square, sort of trying to stop white from going b4. It actually turns out, according to the engine, you can just go b4 anyway, and this is the best move, with the idea that in this sort of position, you sort of just have a lot of compensation with like the open b file, sort of feels a bit like a Benko gambit. It's even possible to go c5 and try and like trap this bishop. That does look slightly scary, I must say. And for that reason, actually, in this position, maybe it would have even just been better to not really try and control b4 directly with the bishop and just go bishop c7 and just try and go like b4. This is a line I have in my analysis. Bishop g4, go for f5, just try and really play very forwardly. Knight c5 is pretty much the only square. e4, and it might look like we're sort of losing the pawn here, but the whole idea with this sort of move is to not actually take, is to go f4, and this is a very thematic pawn sacrifice in a lot of Benoni structures where you sort of get the pawn on e4, which prevents white's pieces from occupying it. The bishop is also, its scope is sort of limited now, and you sort of try to use the f file for your attacking devices. Maybe a knight can come to e5, a rook can come to this file, or maybe this one, and support the d3 break. It can actually be very unpleasant for white to really play this sort of position. But okay, knight e4, and Rishi prepared b4 instead of going for it immediately with rook b1, which is a fairly reasonable move. And after the game, Rishi was saying that he was very concerned actually about bishop g4 in this position. And the idea is that, well, you can't really move your queen to d2 because I'm just going to go f5 and your knight doesn't have any squares. It's trapped. If you go to e1, this is also probably like quite passive, and you don't really want to go here because you exchange these bishops, and then, well, that bishop is generally a very important defender of the king, and now I'm also gaining tempo on your knight. You have to go backwards. Maybe I have even some e4 stuff, knight e5. I don't know, it doesn't look so great. So f3 is sort of forced in a way, and now we can go back to d7. And the whole point is that now if white goes b4, trying to expand on the queen side, black can play f5, knight d2, and the very important move here is that we can go f4 and basically completely shut in this bishop now. And like with g4, that might just be making things worse because now this is like really shut in. And okay, they get like the e4 square, but it's at the expense of this whole piece being like really, really crap. So black, in fact, in this position basically has a really big advantage. To be honest, like yeah, I didn't really consider that. I considered bishop g4, I think, but I just probably didn't think this was anything too special, which was a result of me not seriously considering this f5, f4 idea. It's also possible, I think, for white to play f4. I think Rishi might have been saying something like this afterwards in the sort of post-mortem. We just talked a little bit about the game, nothing too much, but okay, one variation I have is like bishop g4, rook a8, and black is a little bit better. Like white can't really just freely go b4, for example, because we're going to take, go f5, and they're really coming under a lot of pressure in this position. So though what I instead did in the game was, okay, I could also play like a5, naturally stopping b4, this looks very natural, and if a3, you could go a4, right? But you always have to remember in the Benoni that this isn't really that bad if, black gets the open file for the rook and they trade the a for the b pawn. Black usually has enough counterplay in these sort of positions. So black probably should find something else to do. Not that there's anything necessarily terribly wrong with that, but something like f5, for example, feels a bit more to the point. And if say knight d2, again, we can go for the sacrifice e4, and if takes f4, and it really does feel like white is under a bit of pressure. For example, if they just try to keep blasting forward on the queen side, it doesn't really work that well. We can take, go bishop g4, and if they do not play f3, we might just go bishop e2 and like win their rook at the very least. And if they go say f3, we actually have this cute little trick of going bishop h3, and the whole point is if white just takes it, we're going to take, and after bishop g5, the bishop coming in here, which they cannot stop really, it's gonna look pretty damn ugly. But okay, I went for neither of these things in the game. And by the way, there was actually another game that was played from this position. Instead of rook b1, there was rook e1, and this actually used the exact idea that Rishi was talking about. where you go bishop g4, you go backwards, then you go f5, f4, and black basically had a big advantage. They end up drawing because they sort of messed up a little bit, but yeah, that probably would have been a strong idea to consider, which unfortunately did not. But okay, I went a6 here, and I mean, of course, typically the normal way to play against this sort of breaks to play a5, right? But I thought that they're gonna get b4 in any way, so I was like, maybe it's not worth pursuing that too much to try and stop it. And I think also after a5, another thing I should mention is I was also considering knight a3 and black sort of. This is a thing that happens very often in the Benoni. When there's sort of this move a5, you can consider just sort of sliding the knight into b5 where it's sort of on a nice outpost. But this is definitely not really good in this position because, again, I go bishop g4, I go back, and sure, they have a cute looking knight on b5, but if I just pursue this plan that we've talked about a few times now, the knight on b5 really doesn't matter that much. It's a very common case where you have one good looking piece, but the rest of your position is kind of crap. So again, though, what I did in the game instead was a6, and my idea was basically to meet b4 rather, with b5, and this was definitely like a reasonable idea, but again, it probably wasn't the best. And you do allow the passed c pawn. That's always the sort of drawback of going for this. But you sort of say that, okay, well, you have a passed c pawn, but you can't really make that much further progress on the queen side, which sort of gives me a free hand to do whatever I want on the king side. At least in theory, in the game, it didn't quite work out this way, especially because I started playing some sort of weird moves. I played rook b8 to begin with, and basically my idea is to get my sort of rook off of this diagonal, right, where it could potentially be under some sort of threat. Maybe like there's going to be some sort of knight d6 thing, like say in this position, and if I take back, they're going to take, and then like I'm going to lose a piece or something, right? So rook b8 is like a good prophylactic move. At least that's a bullshit I was thinking in my head. In reality, I should probably just play something like bishop d7, protect this knight, and then put the rook on the square like a8, where it's a bit more sort of contributing to society, where on b8 it doesn't really do much, protects b5, and my next move after rook e1 bishop b7 was also not a very good move. The bishop, I sort of had some fancies in my head of like what it's going to be doing in this diagonal. I'm going to play f5 rather, I'm going to move my knight out of the way, I'm going to swap these bishops off. But the reality was that it's just better to keep the bishop on this diagonal. Maybe I can go bishop g4, but I can just go bishop d7 even, and this feels a little bit healthier. We're going to see some drawbacks in the game of why bishop b7 might not have been so amazing. And by the way, it's also worth noting at this point, if I go bishop g4, white doesn't really have to go f3. They can actually just go queen d2. And now if I go f5, there's sort of knight d6 issues. And after take, for example, and let's say queen d6, I think white can at the very least play like h3, take this, and then win the pawn back. And it does look a little bit scary with this sort of king not having the bishop, but I think they are doing okay here. But okay, again, instead in the game, I played this move bishop b7, which really was just lacking in intention. I was playing moves which superficially sort of look not so bad, but in reality are just not that amazing. So knight d2 happened, and this was quite a decent move actually, where you sort of just get the knight the hell out of the way, prevent f5 from coming with tempo. I play f5 anyway, but there's some extra things I need to think about, like is knight f3 gonna come, is there like some sort of bishop move, and this is where we sort of see why my whole like configuration here on the queen side was just a little bit sloppy. White plays a4 to begin with. I'm not going to take it because knight c4 and I give up that square. They're probably going to win back the pawn as well at some point, and the knight's just doing a lot of annoying stuff here. So I want to keep the pawn on b5, and I go bishop f6. I bring my bishop to a slightly more active square. It protects this pawn. Yeah, I'm going to go e4 again at some point, but Rishi sort of came up with this interesting idea where he took on b5 and he went knight a3. And at first when I saw this, I was like, I'm just going to play bishop a8, and your knight doesn't really make that much sense here. Like, sure, it's attacking b5, but at the end of the day, it's not really like I'm protecting it, right? You can't take it, and if you can't take it, what's the knight doing here? Interestingly enough, the top engine move is actually to play knight takes b5 and go queen a4. But from a practical point of view for Rishi, this isn't so great because if you follow the variation a bit deeper, what's going to end up happening is a lot of simplifications. And, when you're trying to win, you don't really want to simplify the position like this. The only reason this is the top choice is because the engine thinks like white is slightly worse, so if it simplifies, it's like then it's equal sort of thing, right? So uh, but from a practical point of view, he wants to keep it more complicated, more pieces on the board. It doesn't really matter if the engine thinks it's slightly worse. So, okay, this is what he does. He does rook a1. And this is a difficult move to face, and this is what I really underestimated. And I think I saw something like this from afar, but like the idea is actually really annoying. He wants to take on b5, and then after takes, go rook takes a8, rook takes a8, bishop takes c6, and he's just sort of winning material for that little sort of tactical configuration. And I also cannot take on b4, of course, because there's going to be queen b3, and that's a very annoying fork, which is actually why a few moves ago, it would have been very nice if I had to go king h8 and sort of got my king off this diagonal, because then if he tried to do this whole same plan, it just wouldn't have really worked, because if he goes like rook a1 here, well, I can just go knight takes b4, and there's no queen b3 check, and you'd have to modify slightly how he tries to sort of get this little plan to work. But bishop f6, sort of, I wasn't really thinking that deeply. It's sort of not the easiest thing to see in the world, I guess. And instead ended up in this very difficult position where black is apparently slightly better, but there's only really one move which keeps the advantage, and it's to go queen e8, which is the least natural move in the world. Like once you understand, like once you see it, you get it, but it didn't really come naturally to me in the game to put the queen in the eye of the rook like this. But like, okay, knight takes b5, and the whole idea is you use the queen to protect the knight and stuff, so they can't really get that tactic to work. And then like, okay, you just reorganize your pieces a bit and you're a bit better. I tried to play bishop g5 in the game with the idea that I'm also using my queen to protect the knight in this way, and they can't obviously like try and take this and take on e5 because I'm going to mate them. But it sort of had the drawback, which I was very aware of, that, you know, the bishop would be a little bit vulnerable here. Like maybe they can try and attack it, but I was like, okay, I can probably gain counterplay in this sort of fashion. And if they were to play a move like knight f3, then I could just go backwards. And now there's no knight takes b5 for it anymore because, well, the bishop is sort of closed off in this diagonal, and of course I'd be very happy to repeat moves. But okay, what instead happened in the game was something which I didn't really pay too much attention to. It was like, I was sort of aware this was a legal move, but I didn't really think about it, like bishop d5 check, and now going knight f3 with the point that, like, oh, okay, now because I go bishop f6 or something, they're going to go knight takes b5, and the bishop is open in this diagonal, so the whole sort of tactic works. So a very nice sort of detail there, which I kind of overlooked, and that made this position very difficult for me to really navigate. I ended up playing rook fd8, which was just bad, and after knight takes e5, which sort of hits like my queen and the knight, more or less obliging me to take, bishop takes a8. Like I went into this knowing I'd be a pawn down, but I sort of had some delusion that I'd have maybe compensation, but by this point I was getting very low on time, and like I think maybe when this position happened, I had 10 minutes, but by the time I made my move, I had like 2 minutes. I just sort of like made a move. I'm like, I don't know if this is that good, but I have to do something. I can't just flag. Well, technically I could, but sort of a bit of a weird way to lose. But unfortunately, this just offered nothing. And after this, I can either take on a8 and play this position, which I saw no potential in, or I can go knight g4, which I thought at least I have some pieces around their king. But in reality, after bishop f3, now threatening my knight, it's not going to last, and he just pushes his pawn. I tried to do some weird tactical stuff, but it just doesn't work. And yeah, in a matter of moves, I end up resigning because there's just no way after takes. And rook takes d8 that I'm going to survive this, right? So in this position, it was already difficult. Like, that is undeniable. There's a lot of pressure in my position, but if you plug it into the computer, it doesn't tell you that because it says this is fine. But there are two sort of routes, I guess, to holding the position. One is rook f8, which looks very natural, but after queen b3, threatening like bishop f7 and stuff, it's not trivial. Like, how do you like really hold this together? Because again, if you go like queen f6, h4 is quite annoying. Now the bishop is actually trapped. So it turns out after this that now you go rook e d8. And now if we see a similar thing with knight takes e5, bishop takes a8, well, this is a much better version of what we just saw because the queens have been on d1 ready to come in and help defend. It's all the way in the queen side doing who the hell knows what. So also I should note if rook takes e5, well, this doesn't really make sense because after rook takes d5, sacking the exchange temporarily, we're going to be absolutely nuking them across this diagonal. So this was one approach. The other approach was similar where you go rook b d8, and the idea again is after takes, takes, bishop takes, a8 takes, rook e5, f4. Compared to the game with rook fd8 and say these moves, right? Like if we just go back to this position, there's a very clear difference where instead of the rook being here, it's here, and that helps a lot with the rook being able to generate counterplay along the f-file. And apparently, if you give this to a computer, it will say black is doing roughly okay. But sort of being panicked, I couldn't really make these, distinguishments during the game, and I end up just playing this, but this was, again, very bad, and I end up really losing without much of a fight. So it was a weird sort of game where it wasn't like there was one, like you could technically say, right, that me playing, like if you put this into an engine like on the Lichess site when this was being broadcasted, it gives rook fd8 is basically the losing mistake. And while that might technically be true, everything else leading up to this, like the whole, maybe a6 b5 thing, that was sort of a bit meh. Instead of going for this bishop g4 thing and trying to go f5 f4, not going like for, I basically never really got very far with my kingside stuff as well. Going rook b8, this was too slow. Bishop b7, the bishop wasn't really that well placed here. It was a bunch of small mistakes that eventually snowballed to the point where, like, even though objectively the computer hates Benoni and says for a lot of the game I was in a bit of an advantageous position, it didn't really feel like that across the board. But okay, again, overviewing what happened this round of the tournament, definitely got knocked down a bit with this loss, my second loss of the tournament. My other one was to Steven Solomon, who recovered this round after a few not so great rounds against Bill Jordan. And some other big things with a threat in Lidgefield, he beat Gary Lane in a bit of a weird game. I think Gary was winning, but did something weird in time trouble. And also Daniel Malemet, he won against Julia. A bit of a surprise, but wasn't a very good looking game from Julia's perspective. He went for this piece sacrifice, if I remember correctly, and was sort of a very one-sided game from what I observed. But okay, yeah, that's all I have to say for today's video. If you guys liked it, please leave a like on the video and subscribe if you are not already, and leave a comment if you have anything to say. But yeah, hope you guys have a good one. See you next time.